Forbidden mystics, the Beguines, and the Church's hidden fear. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where the authority of the Church shaped every breath of daily life, there arose a movement that both fascinated and unsettled the powers of the age. These were not cloistered nuns hidden behind convent walls, nor were they rebellious heretics openly defying doctrine. They were women ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in spirit, who called themselves Beguines. Living in communities without the strict vows of religious orders, they embraced prayer, charity, and contemplation, while remaining part of the wider world. They spun wool, nursed the sick, taught children, and even wrote mystical texts that spoke of an intimate personal union with the divine. To many, they were a living example of holiness, untethered from institutional chains. To the medieval church, however, they represented something far more dangerous: freedom. The Beguines were part of a broader spiritual phenomenon that rippled through the 13th and 14th centuries. They sought a path between lay and religious life, neither bound by marriage nor by the permanent vows of a convent. This middle way attracted thousands of women across Flanders, Germany, and France, widows, unmarried daughters, or simply those who longed for a life devoted to God without surrendering all autonomy. Their communities, known as Beguinages, became vibrant centers of devotion and service. But they were also breeding grounds for suspicion. When women spoke too boldly of visions, ecstasies, or of a soul's annihilation into God, they crossed invisible lines drawn by the guardians of orthodoxy. Mysticism in the Middle Ages was not merely spiritual poetry. It was dangerous territory, for it suggested that an individual, especially a woman, might commune directly with God, without the mediation of priests or sacraments. Figures like Marguerite Porete, a Beguine whose book The Mirror of Simple Souls was condemned and who was burned at the stake in 1310, became cautionary examples. Others, like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich, walked a delicate line, their visions tolerated because they carefully framed them within acceptable bounds. Yet beneath the surface of these stories lies a common thread: the yearning of women for spiritual agency, for a voice in a world that tried relentlessly to silence them. The Church feared the Beguines not only because of their mystical writings, but because they defied neat categorization. They were neither married nor vowed, neither fully inside nor outside the religious establishment. That ambiguity unsettled a system that thrived on control, hierarchy, and obedience. To tolerate them meant admitting that holiness might exist outside the carefully guarded walls of monasteries and convents. To condemn them meant branding thousands of pious women as heretics. Between those poles lay tension, surveillance, and too often, persecution. In this episode, we will journey into the hidden lives of the Beguines and other medieval mystics. We will uncover why their visions captivated so many, why their independence frightened the Church, and how their legacy endures in the whispers of history. These women stood at the edge of faith and freedom, neither saints by decree nor heretics by choice but forbidden. Mystics whose lives illuminate the perilous beauty of seeking God beyond the boundaries of power. The rise of the Beguines, the Beguine movement, did not begin with a proclamation, a leader, or a founding miracle. Instead, it emerged quietly, almost organically, from the shifting landscape of medieval Europe. By the 12th and 13th centuries, towns were growing, commerce was expanding, and a new middle class of artisans and merchants was reshaping society. Alongside these changes came new challenges. Wars left behind widows. Many women sought lives outside of marriage. Others yearned for deeper spiritual fulfillment without submitting to the rigid authority of monastic vows. Out of this fertile ground, the Beguines appeared. They were not a formal religious order, but rather a spiritual phenomenon. Beguines gathered in small communities called Beguinages, clusters of modest houses often built around a chapel or garden. These were not cloisters locked away from the world, but open neighborhoods within towns, alive with activity. The women supported themselves through weaving, spinning, nursing, and teaching, their labor funding both their independence and their service to others. Unlike convents, beguinages allowed members to come and go. The Beguine could enter the community, live a devout life for years, and later leave to marry or return to her family. This freedom was radical in a society that demanded strict categories for women: wife, nun, or outcast. The attraction of the Beguine life spread rapidly across the Low Countries, Germany, and France. In cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Cologne, entire neighborhoods were transformed into beguinages, some housing dozens, others hundreds of women. At their height, beguines numbered in the tens of thousands. They were not bound by vows of poverty, chastity, or obedience in the same way nuns were. Yet they embraced simplicity and celibacy as expressions of devotion. This flexibility appealed to many: women who rejected marriage, widows seeking purpose, or daughters of merchants who could not afford the costly dowries required by convents. What set the Beguines apart was not only their independence, but their spirituality. Many were deeply influenced by the mystical movements of their age, embracing ideas of direct union with God through contemplation, prayer, and ecstatic vision. Their writings reveal a bold intimacy with the divine, sometimes describing the soul as a bride embraced by God, sometimes as a flame consumed in the fire of divine love. These metaphors, while poetic, carried a dangerous edge. They suggested that women could bypass clerical authority and experience God without priests as intermediaries. Not all Beguines were mystics or writers, of course. Majority lived quietly, dedicating themselves to acts of charity, caring for the sick during outbreaks of plague, or teaching children to read and pray. Yet the presence of visionaries among them, women like Hadwich of Brabant, who wrote eloquent poetry of divine love, or Marguerite Porret, whose daring theology challenged the very foundations of church teaching, cast a long shadow over the movement. For the church, the Beguines became a riddle. Were they pious laywomen living holy lives, or were they unregulated mystics threatening to slip into heresy? The ambiguity of their identity fueled both fascination and suspicion. To the common people, the Beguines were admired as healers, teachers, and models of devotion. To city authorities, they were useful contributors to the economy and charity networks. But to the hierarchy of the church, their lack of vows, their independence, and their mystical claims posed a problem. The Beguines were not under strict clerical control. They answered to no abbess, no abbot, no bishop only, to their own conscience and their sense of God's calling. This tension would eventually draw the attention of inquisitors and theologians. For now, in their early centuries, the Beguines thrived, filling a gap in medieval society where women could live devoutly, yet freely, obedient to God but not wholly bound to men. Their rise reflected both the spiritual hunger of the age and the courage of women to carve out space for themselves in a world that preferred their silence. The story of the Beguines is thus not only about mysticism or faith, but about the struggle for autonomy in an age of control. Their communities were both sanctuaries and battlegrounds, places where the desire for God intertwined with the desire for freedom. It was a rise both fragile and extraordinary. A quiet revolution carried out in the shadows of cathedrals and marketplaces alike. Visions, mysticism, and the suspicion of heresy, the Beguines were not simply women who prayed and served. Many among them ventured into the mysterious territory of mystical experience. In their writings, sermons, and personal testimonies, they described visions of radiant light, ecstatic union with God, spiritual journeys that transcended the limits of ordinary devotion. For these women, mysticism was not an abstract philosophy but a lived reality, an inner world where the divine was encountered directly. Yet it was precisely this claim to intimacy with God that placed them in peril, for such experiences defied the rigid hierarchy of the medieval church. Mystical language often drew upon the imagery of love and desire. Hadwich of Brabant, one of the most celebrated Beguine mystics of the 13th century, wrote poetry that described the soul as a bride embraced by love itself. Her verses spoke of longing, rapture, and surrender, blurring the lines between spiritual and sensual. To her, divine love was overwhelming, consuming, and beyond words. While her works inspired followers and shaped later mystical traditions, they also unsettled clerics, who were wary of women speaking with such authority about the divine. Other mystics among the Beguines went even further. Marguerite Porete, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, articulated a theology so daring that it provoked the wrath of inquisitors. She taught that the soul could reach a state of complete annihilation into God, transcending the need for sacraments, confession, or clerical mediation. In her vision, the perfected soul was free from law, living only in pure love. To sympathetic readers, her ideas were sublime, a glimpse into divine mystery. To church authorities, however, they were blasphemous and anarchic, undermining the very foundation of ecclesiastical power. Her refusal to recant sealed her fate in 1310. She was burned at the stake in Paris, her book condemned, and her name branded with infamy. Cases like Porete's cast suspicion over the entire Beguine movement. Though thousands of Beguines lived simple, orthodox lives of service, the shadow of heresy hung heavily over them. The Church had long tolerated mystics when their visions reinforced orthodoxy or were carefully framed as personal revelations. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich, though radical in their own right, managed to survive by cloaking their experiences in humility, obedience, and constant deference to clerical approval. The Beguines, however, were more difficult to contain. Their independence from convent structures meant there was no abbess or superior to keep their words in check. They spoke as free women, and that freedom was threatening. The suspicion reached a climax in the early 14th century. At the Council of Vienne in 1311-12, Pope Clement V formally condemned certain Beguine practices, declaring them dangerous to the faith. Though the decree did not abolish beguinages outright, it tightened scrutiny, giving inquisitors greater authority to investigate and punish. Inquisitorial records from this period reveal interrogations filled with anxiety. Did Beguines believe they were above the sacraments? Did they reject the authority of priests? Did their ecstatic visions mask pride or even demonic influence? Too many clerics, women's bodies themselves were suspect. Medieval theology often cast women as weak, prone to temptation, and easily deceived by spiritual illusions. The fact that Beguines women without vows or male guardianship claimed direct visions of God seemed almost scandalous. If their experiences were real, they challenged the monopoly of the priesthood. If they were false, they threatened to mislead the faithful. Either way, the Beguines embodied a dangerous ambiguity. Yet for all the suspicion, their mystical writings continued to circulate. Their words survived in hidden manuscripts and whispered teachings. And in the hearts of those who found in them a vision of divine love, more profound than any sermon. The tension between their ecstasies and the Church's fear was never fully resolved. Some beguinages endured for centuries, adapting quietly to ecclesiastical oversight. Others dissolved under pressure. The mystics left an indelible mark on the spiritual imagination of Europe. Mysticism in the hands of these women became both a path to transcendence and a spark of rebellion. It gave voice to longings the Church could not entirely suppress: the desire for direct encounter, for spiritual freedom, for God unmediated by hierarchy. It was this combination of beauty and danger that earned the Beguines their place in history as forbidden mystics. Women who saw too much, spoke too boldly, and paid the price for seeking God on their own terms. Persecution, decline, and enduring legacy, the Beguine movement. so vibrant and inspiring in its early centuries, eventually collided with the heavy hand of authority. What began as quiet suspicion soon grew into open hostility, as inquisitors and theologians sought to rein in what they saw as dangerous independence. The persecution of Marguerite Porete in 1310 was not an isolated act, but a chilling symbol of the risks that accompanied freedom. Her execution cast a long shadow over every beguinage, a warning that even the most devout women could be condemned if they strayed too far from orthodoxy. The Council of Vienne in 1311–12 intensified this atmosphere. While the decrees of the council did not outlaw beguinages entirely, they condemned specific practices and doctrines associated with the movement. The official language was vague, but its implications were clear. Women living spiritual lives outside the direct supervision of the church were to be closely watched. In the years that followed, inquisitors carried out investigations across Europe, questioning Beguines about their beliefs, their practices, and their mystical experiences. For many, the mere act of living independently was enough to arouse suspicion. The persecution was uneven, however. In some cities, local authorities valued the Beguines too highly to drive them out. Their hospitals, schools, and workshops were essential to the social fabric, and many communities defended them against inquisitorial pressure. In the Low Countries especially, beguinages survived for centuries, some even flourishing into the modern era. Yet in other regions, particularly in France and Germany, Beguines faced harsher scrutiny. Some were forced to disband, others were absorbed into convents, and still others faded quietly into obscurity. Despite the pressures, the Beguines' influence could not be entirely erased. Their writings continued to inspire readers who longed for a more intimate, personal spirituality. The poetry of Hadwich, the mystical theology of Mechtilde of Magdeburg, and the daring visions of Porete circulated in manuscripts, often copied in secret. These texts spoke to the human heart in ways sermons and dogma rarely could, reminding readers that divine love was something to be experienced, not merely believed. For later mystics and reformers, the Beguines became both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. The decline of the movement was gradual rather than sudden. By the 15th and 16th centuries, beguinages had lost much of their radical edge, evolving into semi-regulated communities tolerated by the church. They became more like charitable institutions than revolutionary centers of female spirituality. Yet even in this domesticated form, they preserved something of their original spirit, a life of devotion lived outside the absolute control of clerical authority. In the Low Countries, beguinages survived until the 20th century, their cobbled streets and quiet gardens bearing witness to a way of life that once shook the medieval church. Now, the enduring legacy of the Beguines lies not only in their communities, but in the questions they raised. Can holiness exist outside institutions? Can women claim authority in matters of the soul? Can freedom and faith walk hand in hand? These questions asked centuries ago remain strikingly relevant today. In an age when religion was synonymous with hierarchy, the Beguines carved out a third way, one that blended devotion with independence, obedience with freedom, contemplation with action. The Church's fear of them was, in many ways, a recognition of their power. They demonstrated that spiritual authority need not be confined to priests or bound by vows. They proved that ordinary women, widows, daughters, spinners of will could live lives of extraordinary devotion, shaping communities and influencing thought. Their persecution was real, their decline inevitable in the face of overwhelming power. But their legacy survived in whispers, manuscripts, and the quiet persistence of faith that refuses to be contained. Today, their memory challenges us to reconsider the boundaries of devotion. The Beguines remind us that the search for God often defies categorization, that the divine can be found not only in cloisters or cathedrals, but in the freedom of a soul seeking love beyond limits. Their story is not simply one of decline, but of endurance, testament to the resilience of faith. and the courage of women who dared to live it on their own terms. Whispers of freedom in a world of control. The story of the Beguines is not merely a footnote in the history of the Middle Ages. It is a reminder of how human beings, and especially women, have always sought pathways of faith that reach beyond the structures imposed upon them. In the cobblestoned beguinages of Flanders, in the manuscripts of visionaries like Hadwich, and Mechthild in the firelit tragedy of Marguerite Porret's execution, we glimpse a current of freedom running through an age of control. The Beguines were never an official order, never sanctioned by a papal bull, never bound by the neat categories that medieval society demanded. They were something far more disruptive. Women who chose their own form of devotion, at once humble and daring, obedient to God, but not entirely to men. The Church's fear of them was not unfounded. A movement that blurred the line between lay and religious, that gave women authority over their own spiritual lives, posed an existential challenge to a system built on hierarchy and obedience. If Beguines could live holy lives without vows, without priests, without monasteries, then the monopoly of clerical control was weakened. Their mysticism, with its fiery language of desire and union, threatened to make each believer a mystic in her own right, less dependent on ritual, more attuned to personal revelation. In the eyes of inquisitors, this was not freedom, but chaos. And so, suspicion hardened into condemnation. Persecution followed, and the memory of the Beguines was nearly erased from history. And yet erasure is never complete. Though their numbers dwindled and their independence was curbed, the Beguines left behind traces that endured through centuries. Their writings survived in secret, their beguinages remained standing in parts of Europe, and their way of life echoed in later movements that sought to combine spirituality with freedom. In modern times, historians and seekers alike have rediscovered them not as quaint anomalies, but as visionaries ahead of their time. Their insistence that devotion could flourish outside rigid categories feels strikingly contemporary, resonating in an age when many question institutions, yet still hunger for transcendence. The Beguines also force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Marguerite Porret's burning was not simply an act of medieval cruelty, but a symbol of the cost of freedom. To claim authority over one's spiritual life, to speak boldly of divine union, was to court danger in a world that demanded silence and submission. Theirs is a story of courage, but also of suffering, a reminder that freedom often comes at the highest price. As we close this exploration, the whispers of the Beguines still linger. They speak of women who refused to be confined, of mystics who saw beyond the walls of churches, of communities that flourished in the spaces between control and chaos. They remind us that the history of faith is not only the history of dogma, but also of yearning, the restless search for God that refuses to be contained. Perhaps this is why the Beguines matter today. They ask us to consider where we draw the boundaries of the sacred. Who gets to define holiness, and what it means to live in the tension between obedience and freedom? Their story is at once medieval and timeless, a testament to the enduring human desire to seek, to love, and to belong to something greater than ourselves. Even when the price of that desire is fear, suspicion, and fire. The Beguines were forbidden mystics, but they were also torchbearers women whose lives illuminated a truth the Church could not extinguish, that God can be found in freedom, in courage, and in the quiet determination to live devotion on one's own terms.